Hello everyone, it's Dr. Paul Rose. This video explains the application of Tinbergen's 4 questions to behavioural ecology and as a practical example to animal welfare. Part of this video is a review of some core concepts in animal behaviour, such as definitions of what behaviour is and specific behavioural types. This presentation covers how we categorise behaviour and how we know what behaviour actually is, the application of animal behaviour knowledge to animal care and management as an example of why behavioural ecology should be used when we consider the uses of animals in society, our understanding of what we mean by behavioural ecology as a definition and an evolutionary construct, and how applied animal behaviour, i.e. the use of data or the use of information on behaviour patterns, how does this allow us to understand animal welfare? To start off, it's always important to remember what behaviour actually is. Behaviour is the observable response that an individual gives to a stimulus, and that stimulus can come from the internal or external environment. So we understand behaviour based on the actions that we see the animal performing, and we determine the cause of those actions based on the environment around the animal as well as its internal physiological state, again based on what we can see. Internal physiological state in some individuals at some times of the year can be very easy to determine. For example, deer in the rutting season, the stags grow antlers, they change their activity patterns, and they change their size and shape. So there is an observable response to an internal stimulus. And that internal stimulus is also influenced by the external environment. We always categorize our behaviors into long-term actions that we call states and short-term behaviors that we call events. And animals perform a range of these different types of behaviors throughout the course of their regular circadian rhythms. If I stick with the example of the red deer stag, we can see that state behaviors or long-term behaviors could be moving, grazing, ruminating, so that's chewing the cud, resting, rutting, which is the courtship behavior, sleeping and being vigilant. These are long-term behaviors because they take up a large proportion of the animal's time. Short-term behaviors or events are instantaneous, happen very quickly, and are very difficult to time or record as a moment of time, so they're normally counted. And these event behaviors could be chasing, vocalizations, scratching or interacting, and then things like posturing, such as flicking ears or flicking the tail of the animal. This would be counted and help us to further understand the long-term behaviors, the state behaviors that are listed on the left-hand side. So we know how to define behavior and we know how to categorize behavior. If we know what behavior is and we know how we can measure it based on it being long-term or short-term, we can apply that knowledge to industry, to practice, animal management, animal care, animal welfare, for example. We could look at well-being, which links to coping and stress. How well is the individual doing within the environment provided for it? We could look at the animal's nutritional status. Is it feeding or foraging appropriately? Is it coping with social pressures on access to resources around it? Is its body weight going to change over time? Is its condition going to change over time based on the environment that it lives within? What happens as the animal ages? How does behaviour change, and therefore the usefulness of the behaviour to the individual change as it goes through the processes of senescence? Senescence is simply the biology of aging. Behaviour tells us about health and disease. Health and disease impact on welfare. Seasonal variation impacts on behaviour. If animals are in managed settings, some behaviour performance might be constrained by season because of the managed environment. We need to consider how we manage the environment across different seasons to allow animals to perform a full activity pattern. Growth and development can affect how behaviour is performed, and by understanding how animals grow and develop, we understand the appropriateness of the behaviour that they are showing. We've already mentioned about physiological changes, and physiological impacts and influences on behaviour are some of the most important that we need to measure, understand, and evaluate. All individual animals, both human and non-human, have different personalities, otherwise termed behavioural syndromes, and temperament. We must factor in this individuality when it comes to evaluating behaviour. And finally, individuals can tell us how they're feeling, how they're thinking, how they're coping, what their well-being is like, based on their movement patterns, posture, and orientation. And we can use these individual signals to get a good idea of what behaviour tells us about the individual state of mind, its fitness and feelings at a current point in time. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it gives you some examples of how understanding what behaviour is and how to measure it can be useful to applied situations. We also need to think broadly across the whole animal kingdom. We're not just talking about the human animal, and we're not just talking about the mammalian animal either. All animals display behaviour, and therefore we can infer well-being, health and fitness and welfare based on behavioural observation, be they in fish or cartilaginous fish such as sharks, frogs, or even invertebrates such as these jellyfish. Behaviour can signal changes in how the animal is coping and dealing with the environment. So we need to remember that all of these individual animals perform particular behaviour patterns that come from the processing of information from the environment. And this processing of individual information will be very specific to that individual animal. And therefore this can tell us about feelings and emotions, even in species that are far removed from mammals, and indeed far removed from humans. So we need to consider how all of these individual species sense the world around them to get an idea of how they process this information and how the environment impacts on their behaviour, and therefore the amount of choice and control they have over what they do and when they can do what they wish to do. What behaviours can or can they not perform in the situation they are currently in. So what I mean by all of that, for the mammalian animal, for the non-mammalian animal, for the human or non-human animal, is that behaviour tells us about welfare. So long as we know what to look for, we can infer welfare state, good, neutral, or poor, based on the animal's behaviour. In policy and law, we have the 5 welfare needs, which are based on the 5 freedoms. And the 5 welfare needs currently state the need to exhibit a normal behaviour pattern. This is stated in the Animal Welfare Act from 2006. From an evolutionary perspective, we can look to behavioural ecology, which is the study of the evolutionary basis for animal behaviour due to ecological pressures. Animals get adaptive and fitness benefits from performing key behaviours. Some behaviours are also highly motivated in their performance. The animal has a strong drive to perform them. So by understanding the behavioural ecology of the species, we know which behaviours that species really needs to perform to get a benefit from that. And therefore, we provide the outlet for that behaviour when we manage that species in a captive environment. And from a pure science perspective, we can look at what we actually mean by animal behaviour study. And from an ethological approach, the study of behaviour in the near natural or natural environment is what we call ethology. And we know our key animal behaviour scientists from the early 1930s are Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen, who were the founding fathers, if you like, for some of the key areas of animal behaviour science that we still use today. However, there are other scientists that are around that have added to their work, which can also be reviewed. For example, Marion Stamp-Dawkins, that also provide more information on the links between animal welfare, animal behaviour, and behavioural ecology. It's no wonder that ethology is called the scientific study of behaviour. It's this consistent, measured approach, making observation objective, not subjective, removing any personal bias as to what we are looking for, that allows us to understand animal behaviour patterns. And the reason why Lorenz and Tinbergen were so monumental in the work that they have done for this field is because they took the animal out of the laboratory and they looked at it in the wild, and they realised how much the wild meant to the behaviours that were being performed. The wild provides the context for the behaviour that we see in the animal in front of us. So ethology is the scientific study of behaviour. And if we put ethology into an applied concept, we need to think about the key components of the scientific study of behaviour that are important for an applied situation. We know that there are some behaviours that are termed fixed action patterns. We know that there are some behaviours whereby the stimulus for that behaviour is really, really strong, and the animal will always give a response if it sees that particular stimulus. And we know there are ways of doing standardized measurement of behaviour using particular criteria of what that behaviour might mean or stand for. These are Tinbergen's 4 questions. An example of a fixed action pattern, and probably one of the most famous of behavioural experiments, is Lorenz's observations of geese rolling their eggs. The rolling action of the goose bringing the egg back to her nest will continue even if the egg is removed. The behaviour will continue regardless of the stimulus being there. A nice example of a sign stimulus is the red front on a male stickleback. That red front, if he sees that colour on another male, will drive him to attack and get the intruder away from his territory. The sign stimulus for the female stickleback is seeing that red front on the male fish will cause her to come into the breeding condition. So the sign stimulus is required for that key behaviour to be performed. And Tinbergen's 4 questions of causation or control, of development or ontogeny, of function or adaptation, of evolution or phylogeny allow us to interpret all the mechanisms and the environmental drivers of behaviour. For example, why is this weaver bird building a nest? What controls that behaviour? How does it develop across the course of the individual's lifetime? How is it relevant for all individuals in that population? And what is the evolutionary construct of that behaviour that makes that one individual as fit as possible under prevailing environmental conditions? So fixed action patterns, sign stimulus, and the 4 questions are key components of the scientific study of behaviour that we can apply to things like animal care, animal management, and animal welfare. So let's think about Tinbergen's 4 questions and this application of behavioural ecology knowledge to what animals show us, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and why that's relevant to their management, how we look after them, and how we ensure their welfare is good. A really important behaviour that all members of the pig family like to do is rooting around in the soil and wallowing. These behaviours are indicative, i.e. they tell us that their welfare is good because they are allowed to perform this activity that's really strongly motivated, i.e. they've got a real internal urge to perform this behaviour. So I'm going to use this example of the rooting and wallowing pigs and apply Tinbergen's 4 questions to it. So the first of Tinbergen's questions is control or causation, i.e. what starts off the behaviour. Pigs are naturally curious, so things in their environment that allow them to dig through the substrates, marshy areas, mud or water that allows them to scratch around and roll in that substrate will provide an outlet for the behaviour. So the presence in the environment of these things starts the behaviour from happening. And the pig's natural abilities to look around its environment, to see its world through its nose as it were, because they have an excellent sense of smell, will be the origin of the behaviour. The next of Tinbergen's 4 questions is ontogeny, otherwise known as development. How does behaviour change across the course of the individual's lifetime? Pigs are going to get more adept, they're going to get better at rooting around finding food when they have more experience of where they're likely to find food. And wallowing is going to be performed more effectively when pigs learn the best places in their habitat where water collects, where there's likely to be soft mud, and therefore where wallowing is going to be optimal. So all pigs are born with an innate, an internal way of seeing the environment through their noses, but they develop how they read and use these cues from the environment, i.e. what the environment tells them, to make this behaviour optimal in the future. The third of Tinbergen's questions is what we call function or adaptation. What's the aim or the reason behind the behaviour? Well, the rooting behaviour, the searching for food, obviously is part of a pig's foraging behaviours. And foraging satiates hunger, it reduces levels of hunger. So the pig is driven to perform that as part of its normal time budget. The more effective you are at foraging, the more efficiently you find food, the more energy you save, and therefore the more energy you will have to spend time on a pleasurable activity like wallowing. So the function of wallowing keeps the pig cool, reduces its blood temperature, allows it to cope with any heat exchange, and it's also a way that the pig calms down, relieves stress, and interacts with others. So one type of behaviour can have many functions to the individual. Tinbergen's final question is called phylogeny, or evolution. What's the evolutionary role of the behaviour? Why has it occurred in this species in the first place? So we're now thinking about the aim or reason of the behaviour. So in this case, pigs are a tropical animal. In the rainforest it gets warm. Wallowing cools you down. You can expose the blood vessels in your skin to the cool water. You can lose heat easily. You can also cover your skin in mud, which blocks the sun's rays and therefore stops you getting heat exhausted, as is the case of some African species like the warthog. As for the rooting behaviour, the foraging behaviour, well, if you have evolved in the rainforest where there's lots of leaf litter, but you've got a very sensitive nose, you need to be able to work your way through that leaf litter in the most optimal manner so you can find the food most easily. Those pigs that root around most efficiently and that use wallowing effectively to cool down will live for the longest time. They'll be the ones most likely to breed, and therefore they'll pass on the genes for these behaviours to the next generation. So here is an example of behavioural ecology knowledge, our understanding of what the animal has evolved to do, and applying that to a captive or domestic setting. If we allow pigs to perform these behaviours when we manage them, we're giving them the outlet for a really important behaviour, and therefore that improves their welfare. It's really important to always consider the wild as our baseline for what behaviour means. Here's an example of a domestic chicken compared to its wild ancestor, the red jungle fowl. When we come to providing for the most appropriate environment for the domestic hen, what we give to that animal to live in, the resources we provide it to interact with, its diet, its social group, the length of time it spends indoors or outdoors, all of that will be linked back to how the animal has evolved for a particular wild habitat. And we can provide optimal care and the best welfare states if we build our captive husbandry and management around information on the wild animals and the ecology of the environment that they live within. This has been well studied in species such as the domestic fowl because of their industrial importance to humans. But this can be linked to all species that we manage, be that at home as domestic pets, on farms as agricultural species, in the lab as research models, and in zoological collections too. Finally, let's bring all of that together to think about what animal welfare is and how it links to animal behaviour. The best definition of animal welfare comes from Donald Broom: the state of the individual as it attempts to cope with its environment. State being the state that the individual is in, behavioural or physiological. Coping, which are the signs that we can see, the stimulus that we talked about earlier, and the environment, which are the prevailing conditions the animal is currently within. The environment will affect the behaviours which link to coping, and that in itself will affect how the individual is responding to the conditions that it finds itself in. Welfare is not just a behavioural construct, it's a psychological construct, it's a physical construct concerning health and disease, and it has behavioural components as well. Some aspects of poor welfare are really obvious. This chicken, just rescued from a battery farm, the physical appearance of the animal, what it looks like, gives us an idea of a poor welfare state. This chicken on a free-range farm, fully feathered and with a bright red comb and wattles, with a normal posture for that individual, gives us an idea of a better welfare state. We put all of this together by measuring the individual's responses, by looking at their behaviour patterns, and, if we are able, by taking physiological measures, gives us the most complete picture of the state of the individual as it attempts to cope with its environment. I hope this video has provided a useful explanation of what Tinbergen's 4 questions are, how they are applied to animal behaviour so we can learn more about it and understand motivational states, and how this knowledge of behavioural ecology from the likes of Tinbergen's 4 questions can be applied to settings such as the managed environment, where we can then learn more about animal welfare states. Thank you very much.